Israel's tumultuous judicial reform. So, Israel's tumultuous judicial reform, what exactly is it? Well, the Israeli parliament adopted a highly controversial law to limit the Supreme Court's powers. This legislation was passed by 64 votes to 0 after the opposition boycotted the final vote. Note that the Knesset has 120 members, so 56 of the 120 were missing. And that's not a big majority. These legal reforms concern the power of the government versus the power of the courts to scrutinize and even overrule the government. Classic separation of powers, good old Montesquieu, the Frenchman who came up with this idea. There we go, linking France and Israel.
France is the center of all things.
Exactly. They're responsible for everything. The government and others say that reform is overdue, though the plans go much further than many people would like. So at the heart of the reforms and the controversy is the so-called reasonableness bill, which removes the Supreme Court's power to cancel government decisions it deems unreasonable. Now, besides the reasonable law, the government wants to, 1, weaken the Supreme Court to review or throw out laws, enabling a simple majority of 1 in the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, to overrule such decisions. Second, have a decisive say on who becomes a judge, including in the Supreme Court, by increasing its representation on the committee which appoints them. Note that unlike the US, where the president nominates judges, in Israel, that is not the case. There is a committee, and this committee has a number of people, particularly the Supreme Court, and particularly the judges have a lot of power when it comes to appointing other judges. And number 3, scrap the requirement for ministers to obey the advice of their legal advisors, guided by the Attorney General, which they currently have to do by law. At the moment, if the legal advisor says this is the law, ministers have to follow. Now, why, A, the government changed the existing law, and B, why is this uproar? And what is the uproar? There are thousands on the street. There are ex-servicemen saying they won't show up for military duty. 1,000 people in the Israeli Air Force reservists have said they wouldn't show up. 10,000 people of the legendary Israeli Defense Forces. By the way, the Israeli Air Force is also legendary, so that my friends in the Air Force don't get upset. So the heart of Israeli society, and note Israel has compulsory military service, except for the religious people, and Israel is very much a modern-day Spartan state. It's a modern-day Sparta. Even women serve in the military. So this is a big deal. But why? Well, the bill to overturn the reasonableness standard was unveiled by Justice Minister Yariv Levin. And this happened after Israel's High Court disqualified Shas party chairman. Shas is one of the parties in the coalition, Aryeh Deri, as serving as Health and Interior Minister. And they disqualified him because he had been convicted on charges of tax evasion, corruption as a public official, bribery, and fraud. Currently, Israel is ruled by a coalition of 6 parties, Likud, led by none other than Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, better known as Bibi, United Torah Judaism, the name tells you all, Shas, Religious Zionist Party, Otzma Yehudit, and Noam. Now, Shas is a Haredi religious political party in Israel, and Bibi formed his government on 29 November 2022, so a few months ago, after the collapse of another coalition government that was in power after the Knesset election, which occurred on 1 November 2022. So that government lasted basically a little shy of 2 months, and Bibi was back in power. And the whole kerfuffle about this reform is that it comes after Deri's appointment was questioned by the court. Deri had been convicted thrice of criminal offenses and failed in his previous public positions, apparently, to serve public loyally and lawfully. So, hey-ho, there we go. You've worked with the Israelis, Glenn. Explain why this turbulence.
Well, tragically, I think all of us have been watching for 15 years or more the slow suicide of a state and a society. It is frightening to watch. And we have the combination of two elements that are leading have led to the crisis now and may lead to the it's an existential threat to Israeli democracy and to the long-term stability of the state, which are personal ambition and search for power by one man, Netanyahu, overlapping with exploiting and being exploited by altogether a rise of religious zeal, extremism on the part of the far right, the ultra-Orthodox population of Israel, which, as you point out, tends not to serve in the military or pay taxes, but benefits from all sorts of social payments from the secular and reviled state, the reviled secular state of Israel. Because of the political democratic system which rewards proportional representation in small parties, and because of a demographic issue that ultra-Orthodox Israelis have substantially more children than secular Israelis, the political dynamics have changed over the past 60 years, in particular in the last 20, so that you now have the ultra-Orthodox in the position of kingmaker, king destroyer, or regime paralyzer, unless they get their way. The United States is experiencing progressively similar things for overlapping reasons itself, and other democracies too, but we'll put that aside for a moment. So that you have...
So just, can I butt in very quickly?
Please,
very quickly. The proportional representation system is very different to the first past, the post system. The first past, the post system operates in the UK, England, arguably the mother of all parliaments. So let's say 5 candidates run for office, the chap who gets 36% of the vote, and the rest of the 64% of the vote is divvied up amongst the other 4 people. Well, tough luck. The chap who gets the most votes wins and represents the constituency. So it is constituency-based, and it's the same system in a different form that was imported, obviously, to the US, that took its inspiration when it comes to common law, when it comes to the first past, the post system, when it comes to its weights and measures, which are still in the former imperial system, pounds and miles, from the mothership. India, of course, also has the first past, the post system, as do most former British colonies. Now, on the continent, and remember that Israelis were largely German Jews or Ashkenazis. Of course, there are a lot of Sephardics who came from other parts, but the foundational
but the culture
movement
was defined by the
by the continent, by mainland Europe, not arguably by the UK, even though Israel was for a while, or Palestine as it was then called, was for a while a British colony after World War I. But the culture, the foundational culture, was very much defined by continental Europe. And in Israel...
Which means, to be a little more specific, which means that they viscerally, profoundly, and intellectually embraced the checks and balances, separation of powers that are propounded by the French thinkers, Montesquieu and de Tocqueville. They accept the rules of democracy and the social restraints. There is no ultra possible in a functioning, diverse society and democracy. And since they accepted that, it functioned. That's not the case.
Now, just a second. Let me give the number. Let me give the figure. If a party crosses 3.25%, it will have representation in the Knesset, which means if you're a far-right party, you cross and members of your community are, shall we say, breeding rather well, then you have 4% of the seats in parliament. And this leads to a very fractious parliament. This makes strange bedfellows. And Netanyahu, or Bibi, as we like to call him, Bibi, in his lust for power, has decided that he would go to bed with all sorts of unsavory characters and even appoint some of them, despite their conviction, as ministers.
He made a deal with the devil, and to keep it biblical, which is that in exchange for the support of the ultra-right, he would continue or press Orthodox, fundamentally ultra-Orthodox Jewish settlements in, we'll call them the occupied territories, in the West Bank of Palestine or Israel, whatever you call it, so that it has been eaten away by thousands upon thousands of colonists, ultra-Orthodox Jewish colonists in the West Bank, making a two-state solution to the Muslim, Jewish, Arab-Israeli historic crisis almost impossible. And that's how Netanyahu has been able to keep power. Why does he want power? He wants power because he wants power, but also because he doesn't want to go to jail. And so long as he is in office, he will not be able to, the state cannot convict him or jail him for the raft of charges on which he has been, the state's trying to hold him accountable for all sorts of graft and bribes and so on and so forth. So you have a marriage of fear and power lust on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu, taking advantage of and being exploited by the ultra-right, which then gets to the Supreme Court issue and eliminating the power of review fundamentally by the Supreme Court. The explanations are all rationalizations. It's to protect the power of Netanyahu and enhance the power of the ultra-Orthodox. And what it means is that you don't have checks and balances. So you will have it's called the theory of the unitary executive. And this is a theory developed by, frankly, first and most explicitly, Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer, which has been embraced by the right wing of the Republican Party of the United States also. And it means the end of democracy as it has been practiced in the West since World War II. And it means, at best, a majoritarian democracy, a la Erdogan in Turkey or, slips my mind, in Hungary. Thank you, Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Donald Trump in the United States. And this is why you have the largest demonstrations in Israeli history opposing this. It's about Netanyahu, it's about the ultra-Orthodox, and it's about the lasting loss of democracy.
Now, there is an argument, though, in the favor of the government, and it is not just people who support Bibi who've made it, and they say that the judiciary interferes too much with legislation. It is fundamentally left-leaning. It is biased in support of liberal issues, and it is fundamentally undemocratic in the way judges are selected. Now, in India, we have seen the extreme example of this. The judiciary has a collegium, and the judiciary selects its own judges, and the idea is they select the best judges. The reality is they select their own kids. So in India, you basically, the judiciary has become the lucky sperm club. So I'm not saying that's the case in Israel, but there is certainly an argument for some democratic oversight of the judiciary. And that is an argument we should not ignore. Now, of course, critics claim that these reforms, particularly in the manner they've come, particularly in the hurry that they've been brought in, and particularly in the context of getting a criminally convicted chap as a minister, they severely undermine a country's democracy. They weaken the judicial system, the only tool that's keeping the government in check. And fundamentally, they save Bibi himself, who should be in jail for corruption. Now, that is the argument from the critics. That is the summary. We have 3 minutes for questions. If anyone has a question on this point, please ask before we move on to the next issue.
Atul, you do underscore or focus us more clearly, explicitly on the fundamental issue, which is the eternal struggle, the impossibility of finding equilibrium in a political system between those who seek to consolidate power so that it can be effective and represent a majority, with those who seek to guarantee protections for all individuals, meaning minority rights, without causing the sclerosis or even paralysis of the state. That was the fundamental issue debated by America's founding fathers as it was writing its Constitution. It's the reason that the Bastille was stormed and the revolution failed, because of the answers given at the time. And I would argue, as strongly as I can, that it's what's at risk if, in this instance, the Netanyahu succeeds in eliminating the check and balance. It would be far better, here I'm opining, I know, far better to have the inefficiencies and frustrations of diverse centers of power in Israel, as has been the case, rather than to see the elimination of them so that a small minority, in this instance, can literally dictate the nature of society.
Now, Anton Schobel has a question. What is it about Israeli political culture that makes fusion of powers less workable than in the UK? Now, I don't understand fusion of powers, but there are fundamental differences in the parliamentary democracy of the UK and Israel. The proportional representation system means there are a lot more parties. In the UK, you basically have Labour, Conservative, and the Liberal Democrats. And these parties are pretty cohesive, even though the UK has now become a very diverse society. Also, the UK has a very strong establishment, so to speak. And what does that mean? That means they have this Confederation of British Industry, they have the Foreign Office, they have MI6, they have Oxford, Cambridge, and other universities, although Oxford, Cambridge have a disproportionate hold on power in all professions, and one could go on. But that continuity in British society allows for more of a collegiate functioning. Having said that, all of that was upended in Britain itself by Brexit, where you had a blue on blue, blue is the color of the Tories, blue on blue civil war, and two Etonians who knew each other forever, David Cameron and Boris Johnson, engaged in fratricide. So, yes, the UK is much better than Israel, but even the UK has been affected by this zeitgeist of fragmentation of society. And having said that, the fragmentation is lesser because the memories are different, the culture is different, and the institutions are different.
I'd say the reason, the explanation, you can look to the ultra-Orthodox Jews and the political party or parties that represent them as and their rise in power because of their rise in absolute numbers and because of the progressive fragmentation of the political system that empowers them, that explain Israel's crisis or the foundation of the Israel crisis. But we see the same in England too. There is much more homogeneity culturally and as Atul pointed about, and institutionally in England. However, if you look at Northern Ireland and the struggle, inability of the British political system to address that issue, I would argue it's fundamentally of the same, the explanation is fundamentally of the same nature as the problems that the Israelis are struggling with now. You have in the Irish case, Northern Irish case, Catholics and Protestants paralyzing themselves and being ultra in their demands, in not accepting the compromises that are fundamentally necessary for democracy to succeed. And that's what we're finding, I think, in Israel now.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.